Our next speaker, Dr. Craig Roell, who has come to us from Georgia Southern University, comes to us under extraordinary circumstances. His latest accomplishment occurred at 4 o'clock this morning when he became a grandfather. For the first time. And I can relate to that, I can tell you. Craig is a master teacher, as many awards at Georgia Southern attest. He is also a man of many parts, having done bibliographies on Lyndon Johnson, a major book on the piano in the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century. But what I know Craig Roell for is sorting stuff out in South Texas, because it's a mess. When Texas does divide into 5 states, the one along the Rio Grande I'm going to call revuelto, like scrambled eggs, because it is sometimes a real mess in South Texas. His books that mean the most to me are Remember Goliad, A History of La Bahia, and because I am working on a biography of Hermann Ehrenberg, who is one of the survivors of what happened at Goliad. I'm not going to use a word because it gets me in trouble. And his latest book is Matamoros and the Texas Revolution. And the biggest mess in South Texas was the Matamoros expedition, which never quite happened. But for something that never happened, it created a whole lot of trouble. Craig may tell us something about that as he talks about the people who are closest to his heart, even though, like me, he's a Texan in exile, off in the original 13 colonies. The people who are closest to his heart, besides his new granddaughter, are the people of Goliad and Victoria. Professor Craig Roell.
It is a singular honor for me to speak about my hometown area of Victoria and Goliad at this symposium honoring Tejanos in the Texas Revolution. The Tejanos of Goliad and Victoria certainly personified the difficulties and divisiveness of the Texas Revolution, and they embodied the conflicting loyalties of trying to be both proud Mexicans and loyal Tejanos. In making very difficult choices, not only were the neighboring communities of Goliad and Victoria divided, so were the families. In choosing sides, these Tejanos were striving to do what they thought was best for their Texas, which brought them into uncomfortable alliances with those with whom they were at odds. Shakespeare quipped with The Tempest that misery acquaints a man with strange bedfellows. This is especially relevant for Goliad and Victoria in the Texas Revolution. Generally speaking, rancheros from Goliad, as led by Carlos de la Garza, defended their homeland against what they correctly saw as American aggression and an attempt by Anglo-Texans to separate Texas from Mexico. In 1836, de la Garza's rancheros played a crucial role in helping the Mexican army to defeat Texas rebel forces, which by then were composed primarily of American foreigners in the Battle of San Patricio, Agua Dulce Creek, Refugio, and Coleto Creek near Goliad. This required de la Garza's men to ally with the Mexican army of President Santana, with whom they greatly disagreed and even disdained. In the end, Carlos de la Garza became symbolic of the proud Tejano standing his ground and providing protection against invaders. After the Texas Revolution, these invaders included incoming Americans who sought to drive Tejanos out of this area altogether, Comanche Indian attacks, and the Mexican army when it attempted to retake Texas in 1842. Only 26 miles away, Victoria's rancheros, led by Plácido Benavides, defended their homeland against Santana's dictatorial policies. They played a key role in the Texas Revolution's early goal of preserving the Mexican Constitution of 1824. This required their alliance with Anglo-Texans and even with American mercenaries who generally considered Mexicans to be inferior and who envisioned the goal of the revolution as making Texas independent of Mexico altogether and even becoming part of the United States. But this was a vision that Tejanos, being proud Mexicans, could not truly embrace, or else accepted only with much soul-searching. Benavides and his men received praise for supporting the revolution, but most of them, having joined a controversial expedition to attack Matamoros, would die at the hands of their own countrymen in the Battle of Agua Dulce Creek, south of San Patricio. As historian Stephen Hardin observed, more Tejanos were killed here than in any other battle of the Texas Revolution. Benavides himself escaped death and would warn Texas forces under James Walker Fannin at Goliad of the Mexican army's advance, a warning that tragically went unheeded. Despite their sacrifice in the support of the Texas cause, which labeled them as traitorous collaborators by Mexican officials, Benavides and the members of the De Leon family into which he had married ended up being accepted by neither side. They became ostracized, symbolic of Tejanos without a country. After the revolution, Anglos drove them out of Texas altogether. Benavides would die in exile in Louisiana. His wife died later in Tamaulipas. De Leon family survivors eventually returned to Victoria to reclaim their historic lands, but it took years of lawsuits and legal proceedings. Goliad and Victoria, so close yet so far apart, perhaps at the time the longest 26 miles in Texas. I grew up in Victoria amid post-World War II prosperity, when the historic ethnic diversity of my hometown was still vibrant. I lived on Guadalupe Street, named for the river that flows through the city, which itself was named Guadalupe Victoria to honor the first president of the Republic of Mexico. I took pride in pronouncing Guadalupe the correct Spanish way. That's partly because I had learned rudimentary Spanish at Juanin Elementary School, named after Irishman John J. Lynn, a famous early settler and Texas revolutionary in Victoria who was called Juan in this historic Spanish-speaking community. For what it's worth, during Spanish days at Juanin School, my name was Enrique, after my middle name Henry, given that my first name, Craig, is decidedly un-Spanish. Another reason that I could pronounce my street's name correctly was because my best friend was David Garcia, who lived across the street and whose family initiated me into their rich Tejano culture, which was much different than the German background of my family. Victoria and Goliad are important, even unique in the history of Texas. This heritage is taught in elementary schools, and the cities of Victoria and Goliad actively promote a historical consciousness, especially through local historical sites. The Victoria Advocate, the state's second oldest existing newspaper, regularly publishes stories and even special editions about the area's rich history. Kids learn early on how Spaniards established missions and presidios in Victoria and Goliad counties. We learned that Victoria was founded by Martín de León, a Spanish-Mexican impresario and rancher whose powerful extended family, which included Plácido Benavides, dominated the area's ranching business, as well as the local governments of both Victoria and Goliad. Their reach extended to Refugio, San Patricio, and even Matamoros. We learned it was another De Leon son-in-law, Rafael Manchola, who as alcalde of La Bahia was instrumental in changing the community's name to Goliad, an anagram honoring the rebel priest of Mexico's independence, Miguel Hidalgo. We learned that St. Mary's Catholic Church, where my friend David Garcia and his family attended, was Victoria's first church, and erected with funds by the impresario himself. We learned that Victoria's Main Street, which is where my dad's photography studio was located, was originally called La Calle de los Diez Amigos. Oops, sorry, there we go. The Street of 10 Friends, to honor the De Leon's friends and family who helped to found the colony, and this included Benavides and Manchola. On this same street where Facetti's Delicatessen now sits was the location of Plácido Benavides' famous Round Top House, which served as the community's citadel against Indian attacks. The historic downtown, centered on De Leon Square, radiates Victoria's history. There are historical markers seemingly everywhere, and as a kid, I must have read every one of them. Meanwhile, at this same time, in the early 1960s, the Presidio La Bahia at Goliad was undergoing a remarkable restoration and preservation with funds from the Catherine Stoner O'Connor Foundation. Its progress regularly reported in the Victoria Advocate. I remember cutting out these articles and making a history scrapbook for my 4th grade class at Huanan School. Thanks to Texas history movies, that ubiquitous paperback book that was in the hands of most Texas school children at the time, courtesy of the Magnolia Petroleum Company, I learned the wider history of the Texas Revolution, especially the Alamo, the Goliad Massacre, so-called, and the Battle of San Jacinto, so-called, San Jacinto, albeit from the traditional Anglo point of view. But I confess that growing up in this wonderfully diverse culture, I remained unaware of the complexity of the Texas Revolution, how it tore apart families and communities, even in my hometown. In my boyhood mind, the Spanish and Mexican history of the Victoria-Goliad area lived in peace alongside the Anglo version of the Revolution. The apparent contradiction between good Mexicans on the one hand and bad Mexicans on the other did not occur to me, even when David Garcia and I went to go see John Wayne's epic movie, The Alamo, in 1961 at the appropriately named El Rancho Theater, where we were impressionable second graders. For years, David and I played Alamo in our backyards like so many boys did, acting out the movie's dramatic death scenes at the hands of Santa Anna's unrelenting soldiers. Though I admit in hindsight something I did not appreciate at the time, David really enjoyed playing the role of the triumphant Mexicans. By the time I actually visited the Alamo in San Antonio and Presidio La Bahia in Goliad, I was thoroughly immersed in the Anglo version of their histories. Therefore, I can perhaps be forgiven the near-religious experience I felt as a kid while walking on the soil turned sacred with the blood of the mostly Anglo martyrs of Texas. Conversely, I was outraged at the treachery of Mexicans. Not yet understanding how Tejanos were caught in the middle of the events that overtook them, I dismissed uncomfortable rumors about Tejanos who apparently betrayed the Texas cause. Rather, I was proud that the De Leon family of Victoria were good Mexicans who had supported the right side. I was yet to learn of the conflicting loyalties and violent racism that Tejanos faced, even in Victoria. I then had no idea that in the aftermath of the Texas Revolution, even the De Leons were driven off their lands despite their great sacrifice. It is ironic that in the intense divisiveness of the Texas Revolution, it is both known but also oversimplified. The time-honored battles and sacrifices of near mythical proportion, the Alamo, Goliad, San Jacinto, seemingly pit Anglo nation builders against Mexican opponents who have been historically viewed as inferior, treacherous, even evil. The traditional and still most familiar interpretations of the Texas Revolution tend to reflect, if not romanticize, an Anglo-Texan point of view. Fortunately, historical scholarship of the last 30 years or so, much of it contributed by speakers and audience members of this symposium, has carved into the traditional story. New histories are more balanced by bringing in Tejano and even Mexican points of view. This is not without its dangers. As historian Jack Jackson once remarked, the problem that I learned after doing my book on the Alamo is that some people prefer the myth to the truth. But it is worth the risk. The Texas story must be seen in the wider context of the bitter civil war sweeping Mexico even prior to the troubles in Texas. It must appreciate the cultural conflicts within Texas itself, and it must recognize the expansionist policies of the United States. As historian Andrés Reséndez observed, the Texas Revolution was only the last leg of a much longer saga of successive revolutions that erupted in all northern Mexican states, not just among Texans. This civil war, as we've heard earlier, in Mexico was between those calling themselves federalistas, who favored more political power and greater independence in the states, and those calling themselves centralistas, who desired more concentrated power in the central government. This division, in historian Arturo Zarate Ruiz's assessment, weakened Mexicans as a people, and made us easy prey to the greed of empires. Thus, this division was complicated by concerns about encroachment by the United States into Mexico's sovereign territory, especially Texas. This ongoing concern dates back to when Spain controlled Mexico. U.S. expansion policy had not only gobbled up the vast Louisiana territory and Florida, but as early as Thomas Jefferson's presidency had attempted to include Texas. Thus, the traditional Anglo interpretation of the Texas Revolution is not completely innocent of a completely innocent claim of freedom fighting oppression, but rather harbors a menacing association with illegal immigration of Americans into Texas, American geographical expansion, and slavery. Although only 26 miles apart, Victoria and Goliad are quite different. Tejanos of Victoria came from a ranching heritage and were more recent immigrants. The De Leons were aristocratic, powerful, and wealthy. Victoria's population was ethnically diverse, with Irish, such as John J. Lynn, and even a few Anglos sprinkled among the Mexican majority. By contrast, the Tejanos of Goliad tended to be descendants of soldiers stationed at Presidio La Bahia, reaching back even to the previous century. Significantly, and this is no small point, the military culture of Presidio La Bahia carried a strong historical tradition of defending the homeland, the hometown, the patria chica, against invaders, whether those invaders were pirates, Indians, the French, Americans, or as it happened in the Texas Revolution, other Tejanos. Yet coexisting with La Bahia's prominent military presence was a thriving ranching culture. Soldiers serving at La Bahia acquired ranches in the hope of receiving titles. For example, Carlos de la Garza's ranch on the lower San Antonio River had been in his family for 4 generations, his father having been a soldier stationed at Presidio La Bahia, where Carlos was born, baptized, and married. Carlos even served as a soldier there himself. Carlos de la Garza acquired title to the family ranch in 1834 as part of the Power and Hewitson Irish colony headquartered at Refugio. The ranch and Tejano community that developed around his homestead was known locally as Carlos Rancho. Today, the isolated location of the ranch and the legacy of Carlos de la Garza are identified by a Texas Historical Commission marker at the large family cemetery, the oldest private cemetery in Victoria County. The de la Garza's mounted militia of rancheros named Guardia Victorianos, or Victoria Guards, protected the area against Indian attacks, cattle rustlers, and bandits. Echoing the long military tradition of Presidio La Bahia defending the homeland, de la Garza and his men were unswerving patriotic loyalists to Mexico. In 1836, they significantly helped the Mexican army under General José de Urrea, who Santa Anna sent to put down the revolution and occupy the Texas coastal prairie. These acts would put de la Garza at odds with his fellow Tejanos at Victoria, who instead would support the Texas cause. During the revolution, de la Garza's ranch served as a well-known safe place for local citizens who found themselves alienated, disaffected, or endangered. Not surprisingly, Carlos Rancho would be branded as a nest of spies and attacked. Victoria also boasted a mounted militia of rancheros led by De Leon's son-in-law Placido Benavides, whose Indian fighting skill was well known. Victoria's rancheros, like Goliad's, with their riding skill, mobility, paramilitary tactics, and intimate knowledge of the land, would play a key role in the events of the Texas Revolution as scouts, stalkers, and fighters. Although, as I've said, Benavides and de la Garza would find themselves on opposing sides. Nevertheless, as historian Alonso Salazar has emphasized, tensions had already developed between Goliad and Victoria prior to the trials of the Texas Revolution. This happened over the election of De Leon's son-in-law Rafael Manchola as alcalde of Goliad. Even though Manchola had served as commandant of Presidio La Bahia and was a forceful critic of Anglo-American colonists, the citizens of La Bahia, Labadeños, did not appreciate the heavy-handedness of the aristocratic reach of the De Leons and protested to authorities in San Antonio. Although this alcalde dispute was settled in Manchola's favor, the incident shows the powerful influence of the De Leons, and it created a schism between Goliad and Victoria that would be exacerbated during the Texas Revolution. Nevertheless, family and business connections between Victoria, Goliad, Refugio, San Patricio, Matamoros, Reynosa, and Camargo naturally led to political and even militia connections among these citizens as Federalist revolutionary movements erupted against Santa Anna throughout northern Mexico. Indeed, a resolution drawn up in 1832 at the consultation at San Felipe by Rafael Manchola and Jose Maria Jesus Carvajal, both De Leon sons-in-law, boldly proclaimed that in the wake of the despotic actions of Santa Anna's centralists, citizens who by their own consent live under the divine republican system, but instead are ruled by despots, are permitted the natural right of revolutionary measures against their oppressors. But by the next year, not only Manchola, but also impresario Martin de Leon died in a cholera outbreak. Their inspiring leadership would be sorely missed as protests against President Santa Anna's policies increased to revolutionary measures. These growing tensions were magnified as Anglos predominantly took the lead in pushing for Texas independence from Mexico altogether, and as volunteers recruited from the United States increasingly flowed into Texas, many with the hope of annexing Texas to the United States. And as historian Edward Miller has shown, they were financed by businessmen in New Orleans for just that purpose. Tejanos were caught between these two revolutionary movements, one to preserve Texas as a loyal Mexican state under the Constitution of 1824, and the other for complete independence of Texas. Complicating this mix, there was even a movement among certain radical Federalists to create a self-governing Republic of the Rio Grande, which would be independent of both Mexico and Texas, which De Leon's son-in-law, Jose Maria Carvajal, would sacrifice greatly to establish. Goliad, with its historic Presidio La Bahia, had an especially strategic position. It protected the key supply line between San Antonio and the port of Copano on the Gulf Coast. As part of his efforts to control Texas as troubles brewed in 1835, El Presidente Santa Anna ordered General Martin Perfecto de Cos to reinforce the government's garrisons at Goliad and San Antonio, but also to disarm citizens, expel troublemakers, and deal with the apparent wayward De Leon family. Cos, in turn, ordered Colonel Domingo Ugartechea at San Antonio to arrest the political agitator Jose Maria Carvajal, who fled home to Victoria with Ugartechea's soldiers in hot pursuit. But at Victoria, Placido Benavides, who was the captain of Victoria's militia, successfully resisted Ugartechea's men and boldly asserted, quoting John J. Lind here, that as a constitutional officer under the Constitution of 1824, he was not at all amenable to Santa Anna's centralist policy. Meanwhile, in advance of General Cos's mission, a small Mexican centralist force occupied Copano and Goliad in July 1835. They arrested Goliad's alcalde, stripped the town of its arms, pressed citizens into service, and quartered soldiers in their homes. Naturally, this infuriated residents. Clashes with Mexican soldiers occurred several times, which underscores that Tejanos suffered even at the hands of their fellow countrymen. General Cos himself arrived at Copano with some 400 soldiers in late September 1835 and quickly occupied Goliad. Demanding loyalty, Cos essentially forced area citizens to choose sides. As historian Ana Carolina Castillo Krem vividly puts it, brother was pitted against brother, neighbor against neighbor, and friend against friend. Carlos de la Garza formed a company of loyalist rancheros to support Cos, while Placido Benavides formed the opposition. General Cos soon took most of his men and departed Goliad for San Antonio, leaving behind a small force to hold the Presidio. Benavides and Lynn went to Gonzales to train volunteers amassing there after the come-and-take-it battle, and also to engage them in a bold strategy to intercept Cos before he reached San Antonio. But Benavides and Lynn were unsuccessful in persuading these men. Frustrated, they joined another company of colonists who wanted to liberate Goliad from the centralist garrison left behind by Cos. As it happens, yet another company of men, these from the Matagorda area under George Collinsworth, also set out with the same goal. When these men reached Victoria, they were reinforced by additional colonists, including Jose Maria Carvajal, brother-in-law Silvestre de Leon, Mariano Carvajal, Jose Maria's younger brother, and Philip Dimmitt, who was married to the daughter of a kinsman of Martin de Leon. Lynn also sent word to the nearby Irish settlement at Refugio, asking for volunteers. Among those responding were was the colony impresario James Power, Refugio militia leader Hugh MacDonald Fraser, and Thomas O'Connor. Collinsworth's combined force now numbered 120 colonists, Tejano, Irish, and Anglo. Many signed a document in Victoria pledging loyalty to the Constitution of 1824, and then they set out to liberate Goliad. This was accomplished in a surprise attack lasting about 30 minutes with only light casualties on either side. The defeated Mexican soldiers retreated south to the fortification of Lepantitlan at San Patricio, making this the only centralist stronghold between Matamoros and San Antonio. In the wake of this victory, General Stephen F. Austin ordered the majority of Collinsworth men to leave Goliad and join in the siege of Béjar, already underway to drive General Cos out of San Antonio. Among these men were Placido Benavides and his Victoria rancheros, including Silvestre de Leon. They would serve with distinction in the final assault and with the occupation of San Antonio in December, such that Benavides was offered the rank of first lieutenant in the regular army. He turned down a chance to serve in William Barrett Travis's cavalry, but instead he joined the Mexican Federalistas of Colonel Jose Maria Gonzalez, who also had participated in the siege of Béjar. After helping to drive Cos out of San Antonio, Benavides and his rancheros set out towards the river towns on the Rio Grande to gather information and to aid in Colonel Gonzalez's plan to raise allies against Santa Anna from among Federalists in Matamoros, Reynosa, and Camargo. Given that Benavides was from Reynosa and had connections in Camargo and Matamoros, he was the perfect man for this job. Meanwhile, Philip Dimmitt was elected commander of the residual force of the Texas colonists still at Goliad. To show his allegiance to Mexican Federalists, Dimmitt designed what became the famous green, white, and red tricolor flag bearing the date 1824 in the middle. "I have made a flag," Dimmitt wrote to Austin in October 1835. "The colors and their arrangement are the same as the old, with the words Constitution of 1824 displayed on the white in the center." Dimmitt then authorized an attack, which was successful, on the centralist garrison at Fort Lepantitlan, thus effectively cutting the centralist line between Matamoros and San Antonio. Significantly, controlling Fort Lepantitlan was part of Dimmitt's larger plan of a joint expedition uniting Texas colonists and Mexican Federalistas of Tamaulipas to occupy the city of Matamoros, an expedition hoped to be led by General Jose Antonio Mejia. The strategy to occupy Matamoros would not only secure the city's vast trade revenue to help fund the revolution against Santa Anna, but by uniting with Mexican Federalists, this Matamoros scheme was also seen as a way to draw Santa Anna's attention away from Texas. Unfortunately, centralist forces defeated General Mejia at Tampico, which temporarily ended the plans to occupy Matamoros. Of course, none of this made Santa Anna happy, especially in the humiliating defeat in September 1835 of General Cos's centralist army in Béjar. Significantly, the victorious rebel forces, which included Tejano, Irish, and Anglo colonists, as well as Mexican Federalistas, also included increasing numbers of volunteers from the United States, primarily recruited and funded in New Orleans. Intensifying matters was Philip Dimmitt's proclamation at Goliad in December, which history remembers as the Goliad Declaration of Independence. This document, which pledged that Texas ought to be free, sovereign, and independent, was signed primarily by Anglo and Irish volunteers and area citizens, but included two significant Tejanos, De Leon's son-in-law and former Goliad alcalde José Miguel Aldrete, and Mariano Carvajal. Accompanying this document, Dimmitt designed a new flag called the First Flag of Independence, which depicted a bloody arm holding a bloody sword on a white field. It has long perplexed historians why Dimmitt so radically changed from being a staunch Federalist to a radical supporter of Texas independence. Yet he did have his reasons. The most reasonable answer comes from his connection with the De Leons. Intent on helping any forces willing to oppose Santa Anna, the impresario's oldest son, Fernando de Leon, and his brother-in-law, José María Carvajal, and Carlos Lasso, Dimmitt's father-in-law, went to New Orleans to exchange horses for over $3,000 worth of supplies and munitions for the Texas cause, a substantial sum in 1835, which they were now bringing to Texas aboard the schooner Hannah Elizabeth. The schooner ran aground on a sandbar in Matagorda Bay and was captured by a Mexican naval vessel. De Leon, Carvajal, and Lasso were captured and eventually imprisoned in Matamoros, only to escape with help from friends in the city and the unrelenting efforts of their brother-in-law, Placido Benavides. The men made their way back to Victoria, passing first through Goliad. There, they reported to Dimmitt that on their departure, they were informed by a friend that there was in circulation a decree of the general government that all Mexicans, foreigners, or Americans without distinction be taken as prisoners on this side of the Rio Grande should immediately be put to death. Another friend, who provided the men with horses for their escape, warned them to avoid the main road, because there he had seen the bodies of 5 foreigners apparently executed in accordance with this decree. De Leon and Lasso further reported news from the commander of Matamoros' deep water port at Punta de Isabel, who told them that the government had ordered all vessels from New Orleans bound to any port in Texas should be taken to Veracruz as a lawful prize. And further, 5 schooners were ready to sail from Veracruz to patrol the Texas coast. Even more ominously, a courier extraordinary informed them that some 3,000 soldiers under General Ramirez y Sesma were marching into Texas. Learning this information cinched Dimmitt's decision only 2 days later to take the next radical step, which history remembers as the Goliad Declaration of Independence. More and more Americans were recruited and became involved in this increasingly divisive revolution, particularly the scheme to occupy Matamoros, which I assert is central to the events exploding in 1836. But the intriguing story of the various expeditions of Matamoros would require a book to tell. Okay. It's shameful, I know, it's all right. An oversimplification is this. The Texas provisional government authorized no less than 3 expeditions to capture Matamoros, one under the command of Frank Johnson, one under James Walker Fannin, and one under Sam Houston. Owing to a cantankerous split in the government, these commanders were tragically pitted against each other. Johnson's expedition consisted primarily of American volunteers recruited from among those who had participated in the siege of Bejar, notably the New Orleans Greys. Johnson's goal was to ally with Mexican Federalistas in northern Tamaulipas, especially in Matamoros, Reynosa, and Camargo. Evidence suggests, however, that this plan was really the brainchild of Johnson's friend, Dr. James Grant, a Scottish-born owner of significant estates in Coahuila and formerly a member of the Coahuila y Tejas state government. James Walker Fannin was independently in charge of another expedition that was supposed to occupy Matamoros, theoretically teaming up with Johnson and Grant, but this was never made clear. Fannin, originally from Georgia, also recruited American volunteers for his expedition force, specifically the Georgia Battalion. Owing to the bitter division in the Texas Provisional Government, Sam Houston was authorized as a rival commander of an expedition. It is worth repeating that the majority of men recruited by Johnson and Grant and by Fannin were not Texas colonists, but volunteers or mercenaries from the United States. Moreover, the promised reward for their service was to be the spoils at Matamoros, which only adds to this controversy. So even if Johnson and Grant or Fannin were honorably trying to team up with Mexican Federalistas to hinder or thwart Santa Anna's centralist army, it would have been quite disturbing to patriotic Mexicans as they learned that these expeditions to occupy Matamoros were mostly foreigners, that is, Americans, of whom Mexicans from long experience were distrustful. It did not help that when Fannin's men occupied Presidio La Bahia, they sought to root out local loyalists, which included Labadeños hiding out on Carlos de la Garza's ranch, which Fannin saw as a nest of spies. But as historian Paul Lack notes, although Goliad was a loyalist center, much of the actions by locals were less in support of centralists as merely self-defense. Furthermore, apparently Dr. Grant's true objective was the creation of an independent Republic of the Rio Grande that would be separate from both Mexico and Texas. Given that Plácido Benavides and his Victoria Rancheros joined Grant's men, and Benavides knew Grant, it is possible that Benavides had also become devoted to this cause. That Benavides' brother-in-law, Jose Maria Carvajal, later became a significant leader in two future efforts to create an independent Republic of the Rio Grande makes Benavides' motivations even more intriguing. What none of these leaders of these expeditions to Matamoros anticipated was Santa Anna's choice of General Jose Cosme de Urrea to lead a division of the Centralist Army and put down the rebellion and occupy coastal Texas. Urrea was not only a brilliant leader and talented, but also a Federalista at heart. Urrea undertook his own expedition to Matamoros and the other Norteño towns, particularly Reynosa and Camargo, to convince Federalists there of the treachery of Texas rebels who were betraying the Federalist cause, regardless of their profession, to the Constitution of 1824. Moreover, Urrea used to advantage the intelligence that he gathered that the rebels engaged in the expeditions to Matamoros were mostly foreign mercenaries from the United States. In other words, Urrea undercut whatever plans that Johnson and Grant or Fannin or Benavides had for allying with the Mexican Federalists in Tamaulipas. Urrea did the same thing then among Tejanos as his army advanced into the coastal prairie and across the Nueces River, so much so that patriotic loyalists such as Carlos de la Garza and his Goliad Rancheros and as many as 200 other area Tejanos served Urrea as scouts, spies, and advanced skirmishers. Indeed, these Tejano loyalists played a major role in General Urrea's successful defeat of Johnson and Grant's forces, which included Benavides' Rancheros at Agua Dulce Creek and at San Patricio, and also of Fannin's men at Refugio and Coleto Creek. As mentioned, Benavides escaped death and rode hard to warn Fannin and the settlements that the Mexican army was looming. Reaching Victoria, Plácido sought refuge on his ranch, bearing the news and the heavy burden of being the sole survivor among his friends and comrades killed at Agua Dulce Creek. Among Fannin's men executed in the Goliad massacre was one Tejano, Mariano Carvajal. You may recall that only 3 months earlier, Mariano was among those who signed the Goliad Declaration of Independence at the same Presidio where he now was imprisoned and shot on Palm Sunday, March 27, 1836. Philip Dimmitt later honored him by testifying to the controller's military service record that he fought with greatest gallantry and enthusiasm, and he behaved on all occasions like a true soldier of the cause of Texas, and manifested the most sincere and ardent devotion to that of independence. Fernando de Leon, who had been appointed in February 1836 as aide-de-camp to acting Governor James Robinson, assumed command of Victoria's militia, as well as the responsibility for provisioning, arming, and all other things necessary for the support of the Army and the protection of the defense of Texas. When General Urrea's army occupied Victoria, the De Leon extended family, particularly Benavides, Jose Maria Carvajal, Fernando, and Sylvester de Leon, were considered traitors and were sought out for arrest. General Urrea had Fernando incarcerated even after he gave over hidden supplies intended for the Texas cause. Ironically, this act led later to Fernando's arrest as a traitor by the Anglo-Texas Army that occupied Victoria under General Thomas Jefferson Rusk after the Battle of San Jacinto. Rusk essentially told Victoria's Tejanos either flee to Mexico or surrender their cattle to the possession of the Texas Army. The negative treatment of Tejanos of Victoria and Goliad by General Rusk's Texas Army was exacerbated by the discovery of the grisly remains of Fannon's men from the Goliad massacre. In Rusk's custody, Fernando de Leon was wounded in an assassination attempt, an act reflecting the bitterness of many Anglo-Americans whose creed, according to John J. Lynn, was the total extermination of the Mexican race and the appropriation of their property to the individual use of the exterminators. Though released without trial, Fernando was ostracized, and then in late June 1836 was forced into exile by the Texas Army along with his brother Silvestre, Placido Benavides, Jose Maria Carvajal, and some 80 members of the De Leon extended family. They were escorted and forced to board ships to sail to Opelousas, Louisiana, where the family had business contacts, abandoning a fortune in property and possessions. Victoria afterward became, according to one witness, a wild Anglo-American town dominated by an army and many newcomers who distrusted and hated Mexicans. Ironically, the De Leon family was cited as delinquent in paying their substantial 1840 property taxes to the new Republic of Mexico. Next Tuesday, no comment. In conclusion, one could argue that the citizens of Goliad and Victoria both lost and won in the Texas Revolution. Fannon's men burned Goliad in advance of their retreat to Victoria. In the aftermath of the Battle of San Jacinto, the retreating Mexican army passed through Victoria and Goliad, returning to Matamoros. As Mexican Lieutenant Colonel Enrique de la Peña recorded, the residents of Goliad, who had suffered much, became quite angry with us and insulted us, saying that we were fleeing as cowards from a handful of adventurers. The Tejano citizens of Victoria were also caught in the middle. Led by the De Leons to support the revolution, they were unable to flee from General Urrea's advancing Mexican army because Colonel Fannin had earlier seized the town's oxen for his own forlorn retreat. Under occupation by Urrea's army, Victoria's citizens were seen as turncoats. As Santa Anna's second-in-command, General Vicente Villasola judged it, all the individuals of Victoria's families were the most assiduous collaborators in the Texas Revolution, persuaded that they would gain great advantage from the triumph of the usurping colonists and against their own country. However, they were miserably mistaken and received their reward. They entrusted all they had and instead received scorn, persecution, wounds, and even expatriation. Finally, what is the lesson in all of this? Mexican historian Ramon Eduardo Ruiz aptly puts it this way: it is risky business to gamble your well-being on foreigners. No one knew this better than the Tejanos of Goliad and Victoria during the Revolution. If you in the audience have ancestors on either side of this divide, be proud. Be very proud, but be glad that you were not there in 1835-36 to have made such a traumatic choice. Today, the descendants of these courageous Tejanos live proudly among people who may not even know this rich heritage. In July 2010, a seventh-generation descendant of Carlos de la Garza got married in Presidio La Bajia's chapel, just as Carlos had done back in 1829. And in April 2011, descendants of the De Leon family came from around the state and nation for their large family reunion at Victoria. Among the events was the unveiling of a new monument to Plácido Benavides at Victoria's City Hall Plaza, at the very site where in 1835 Benavides defended his brother-in-law José María Carvajal from arrest by Mexican centralist soldiers. Perhaps in the most appropriate tribute, Carlos de la Garza's ranch, though no longer in the family, still offers people refuge. Down a quiet, isolated stretch of road past the De la Garza family cemetery, nestled among ancient gnarly oaks, near the San Antonio River, is the site of the Spiritual Renewal Center operated by the Catholic Diocese of Victoria. According to its mission statement, the purpose of the center is to offer people of the diocese and others a haven for prayer, reflection, and spiritual nourishment. In that spirit, I leave you with these words. Change your grievance story to remind you of the heroic choice to forgive. You always have in your power the hand to create your own ending. This is the best and most honorable legacy to these his heroic ancestors. Gracias.